Okay, hello everybody. This is the ranch, Becky and Lou, and the dogs and cats. And we're going to do Acts 24. That's the little dog I showed you last week. And her name is Baby, and she's still up for adoption. So if you want to adopt her. And then there's other animals here. All right, I got caught in a rainstorm coming out here, and then I kind of read the chapter a little bit. It was busy and just reviewed it again. The last few chapters that we've done, one thing that we'll accomplish, of course, is we'll have finished the whole book of Acts, which is one of the books of the New Testament. And it's not that short. So there's some letters in the New Testament that are short. And by going chapter by chapter, you realize you can read the whole Bible actually on your own. And I got friends of mine, and sometimes they say, I've tried to read it, John, or different, maybe they'll pick up a chapter somewhere. I said, well, if you go consistently, even if you just read, myself now at night, I read about only 2 chapters a night. Over the years, I used to read 4 a day, but I've read through it multiple times. As long as you have a system, you don't skip around, you can go through the whole Bible. And so at least at the end of this, I just finished the Gospel of Mark the other day. So whoever watched all those videos, which was started in New Jersey, you went through the whole Gospel of Mark. So just pick a spot in the New Testament, one in the Old Testament, but do it consistently. Where if you start in John's Gospel, then you read all the way to the book of Revelation, then start in Matthew, which is the beginning of the New Testament. It's that kind of system. Acts 24. Paul, at this stage, was sent, he kind of was rescued by that Roman commander or captain that realized there was a plot to kill Paul by the Jews. And the high priest, whose name was Ananias, he was in charge of the Sanhedrin, which was like a Jewish court. And they made up, we taught this in the last chapter, and they had this little plan that they were going to kill Paul. There were 40 men that said, let's kill him. The plot came to the awareness of this Roman commander or captain, by the name of Lysias, I think he was, and he rescues Paul, and then he sent him to this little town that had the jurisdiction over the Jewish area by the town of Caesarea, and he's now like appealing before one of the Roman governors by the name of Felix. So, this is where the story led us to this point. Okay. This man Felix, who's the Roman governor, he read the little letter that the other Roman commander had sent to him, said, I took this man Paul and I rescued him from the Jews, so everybody's kind of, we'll do it in a second here, but you'll see in all the official talking back and forth between people, they all are managing to lie, to butter up to one another, and to kind of take the truth and make it more beneficial to their particular side. And it's interesting because you would think that the official people would just want what's true, but you'll find them doing a lot of manipulation, a lot of lying. It's kind of inherent within humanity. So, at this stage, the Apostle Paul is appearing before this man by the name of Felix, the governor of that area. And they had to wait for the accusers, who were Ananias the high priest and all the other Jews that were going to kill Paul. Well, they had to wait for them to come down, and so they could hear the accusation before, like Paul's appeal now at the next step, if you will. Okay, Paul is sitting, if you will, before the court, and they have a man by the name of Tertullus. He's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, but this man Tertullus, it says, he was an orator, meaning he knew rhetoric, he knew the art of language to persuade people to your side. Some famous Christians in the early church, St. Augustine and others, were trained in the field of speaking and rhetoric and all. So this guy Tertullus, he goes before this governor in this court proceeding, and if you just read it, it's kind of a short chapter, Acts 24. It's like the classic suck up, the butter up, and he stands before this judge, Felix, this governor, and says, "Oh, great governor, our people have been so blessed by you, and you're such a great leader to our people, and we are so happy to be before you." And then he says, "But so I'm not more tedious unto thee, let me get to the point." And it's just, you could see people, when we read of Jesus in the Gospels and his speaking to people, oftentimes he was combative and confrontive and got right to the point. But in the legalese and all that we're reading, there's so much crap going on. So this guy is here to charge the Apostle Paul in this court. And he says, "Now, lest I go on to buttering you up, Judge," he says, "here's the accusation. We have found the Apostle Paul, this man Paul, to be a troublemaker. He's going around, and it even says throughout the whole world, the known world, he's causing all this trouble. He's dividing people. He's this troublemaker. And we were going to take Paul." Tertullus is representing Ananias and the local court that were actually getting ready to kill Paul. He says, "But we were going to take Paul and judge him by our own court. But the chief captain, Lysias, who's the other man who rescued Paul, says, he came and violently took Paul away from us." So already this guy's lying. And he's like a lawyer, right? It's almost like a prosecutor, if you will. He's lying. He says, "We were going to do it ourselves, but Lysias, the Roman captain, he violently took him away." Well, what actually happened was he rescued Paul because they were getting ready to kill him. But they're lying right here. We're reading it 2,000 years ago. Even in the official courts right there, they're lying. So he listens to the accusation, and then the governor, Felix, he tells Paul, he says, "Now let me hear your side." Now Paul doesn't butter him up, but he does say, I'm grateful, Judge, that I have a chance to speak for myself." He says, "Because I know you are learned and you're a good judge and you listen to all sides." And then Paul gives his defense. And he says, now these last few chapters that we read only cover about 12-day period, all right? Sometimes in the Bible, you read in a chapter and then you go to the next chapter and it might be covering a period of almost a year or so. But in the last few chapters, it's only covering 12 days because Paul himself brings it up right now. He says, here's my case. He says, "It's only been 12 days since I went into the city of Jerusalem." This is now covering the last few chapters. He said, "And when I was in Jerusalem, I came to bring alms deeds, money and charity," which he was going to do for the poor saints, the poor Christians that were at the city of Jerusalem. He said, "And nobody found me causing trouble. Nobody found me stirring up people. I wasn't committing any crimes." And what really happened was when the Jews, Paul says, the Jews from Asia, these were the people following Paul that didn't like Paul, and they kept stirring things up. He said, "And when they heard that I was in the temple, they're the ones that came and took me." And that's really what happened. If you remember a few chapters back, when Paul was in Jerusalem, he talked to the leader, James, and James warned him, the apostle James, who's the lead apostle in Jerusalem. And James warned him and said, "Man, everybody in Jerusalem's heard about you, Paul. They're all mad at you. Therefore, let's kind of do a little thing. Come on in and show yourself that you're a good guy." But word got out when Paul was at the temple in Jerusalem, and they said, "This is him. Let's get him." So really, Paul really committed no crime, and he's recounting this to the judge, Felix. He's saying, "Look, I didn't do anything wrong." And then the process began starting. They got Paul, and now he's before a judge. And he's saying, and if the people that were at Jerusalem that day, if the charges against me are by those people that I was causing trouble and I was causing riots, he said they should have been here. Because those particular Jews from Asia were not there this day. but instead they had the other Jewish people that were bringing these accusations. So then Paul he always brings up the message of the gospel, the message of the resurrection. And then he says to this judge, and now all the people are there listening, both sides, he says, the reason that I am here and having all these problems is I worship God, and I believe all that was written in the law and the prophets about the resurrection, particularly the resurrection of Jesus. He says, but I'm called in question because I worship God and I believe in the resurrection of the just and the unjust. And he says, this is the problem that these other people have against me, because he was going around preaching the resurrection of Jesus. And he said, if there's anything else that needed to be brought before the court, he said, let it come out now. And he said, and that's really what the issue is. So in essence, it was a religious issue. It was an issue about belief. Now, this judge by the name of Felix, what he does is he listens to both sides, and then he puts Paul sort of like in custody, sort of like in jail, but he gives this command. He says, hold him in the holding cell, keep him in jail for now. He says, and let his friends come to him, kind of let him, don't be too strict on him. And he listened to both sides. Now, this judge actually, I'll do a little history, and it's important to get the name of his wife. This judge by the name of Felix had a wife by the name of Drusilla. We won't go long, but this will be the one history point when we're done with this chapter. He had a wife by the name of Drusilla. And this judge Felix, when Paul was in jail, it says he went to visit Paul. Now, if I forget to mention it, Paul is actually going to wind up staying in jail for a whole two years during this proceeding. Okay? He's going to wind up sitting in that county jail for about 2 years. Some of my friends sit in the county jail for almost that long when they have things going on in Nueces County. But the top guy by the name of Felix, he visits Paul, and Paul preaches to him, it says, about righteousness and judgment and our accounting to God. So these little visits this Felix had with Paul was preaching the gospel to him. He was telling him about God. He's instructing him. And it even says Felix trembled at one point because it was like a strong message. But it also says Felix visited him in jail often, hoping that this is now in the Bible, hoping that the Apostle Paul would give him money to let him out of jail. Even though this Judge Felix now has a bunch of other people that have already appeared before him that have shown themselves to lie, the official lawyers and everybody, they're all lying. Even he is corrupt, this man by the name of Felix. It says he visits Paul, hoping that Paul was going to give him money, and then he would let Paul out of jail, which is basically bribery. But he goes one time during these visits over this 2-year period, and he brings his wife Drusilla. Now, Drusilla was married to another king at the time when she was younger. She divorced him. I think it was an area by Syria. There's a particular name, I forget the name of that area. But she kind of was young. She divorced this guy so she could marry Felix, who is the judge here. And I think it's Felix's third wife, and this is the lady by the name of Drusilla. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa the first, who is somebody I've taught about the last year or so, reading through the New Testament. And she was the sister of Herod Agrippa the second, and she had her own son by the name of Agrippa as well. There were a few Agrippas we read about in the Bible. Why will this be important? Because I wanted to pick one historical thing that I can do, and that's why this will be important. But let me end the chapter first, and then I'll get to why this lady and her son, the wife of Felix and her son Agrippa, make it into the history books over a particular thing that happened. Well, as they're visiting Paul, and he even brings his wife to see Paul, this went on for a couple of years. Paul's sitting in jail waiting for his case to be resolved. Were these accusations against him true? Were they not true? The other thing to note is Paul sat in jail for 2 years. The accusations were false. But just to hold somebody, there's a famous case. Now I forget the name of it, but I mentioned it before. And it's an area where I grew up. And it was a young black kid. And I've talked about this the last few years. He was picked up by the cops in New York City because one of his other classmates said he stole his backpack. Now, believe it or not, that was enough. Okay, one kid in the class, New York Public School, said, this kid stole my backpack. Fine. I think he might have been 16. He was a teenager when he was arrested, this boy. I forget his name. He goes, they hold him in Rikers Island. Rikers, there's prisons up north, one called Rahway in New Jersey, Rikers in New York. And of course, all these prisons have like histories, and Rikers is one that has a history. So they hold the kid there because he stole a backpack. What do you think the charge should be on something like that? He, when he was interviewed by the cops, basically said, I didn't steal it. Okay? We think you stole it. The other classmate says you stole the backpack, but you say you didn't steal it. He says, that's right, I'm telling the truth. He was 16. They kept him in Rikers prison for over 2 years. Now, over something like that, there was video of him, this came out later, of the guards beating him up in one of the hallways, this famous case. And when you looked at that, you would think, how could they have held that kid for over 2 years in an adult maximum security prison, guards that had beat him up? How could that happen? It should have been, if the kid said he didn't steal it, okay, and that means what? It means you go before a judge. You have like a little jury trial. That should have took place within a period of a couple of months, not like 2.5 years. There was a documentary, I saw the boy later when he got out of jail, but he committed suicide a couple years ago when he was, I think, 20-something. But the effects of him being in that prison, sitting there with a stupid charge like stealing a backpack, and then later that kid did kill himself, and his family and all said, look, he never got over that. That's not as, what happened to that kid is even worse than what happened to Paul. But he's sitting there for 2 years. What happens at the end of the chapter, then I'll get to the history I wanted to give you. Another man by the name of, I like calling him Porcius Festus. That's his name in the Bible, Acts 24. But it might be Porcius. But I always like calling him Porcius. I don't know why. But this man, Porcius Festus, he became the next governor. He took Felix's position. There was like a rotation. And it says Felix at that point, being he was no longer going to be the governor in charge of the whole matter, he could have let Paul out. He could have resolved that at the end. It says, but he left him in jail, willing to show the Jews a favor, just to gain. So the other people that wanted Paul in jail, just to kind of make them happy, he let him sit in jail. And that's how the chapter ends. But as we go through the book of Acts, a lot of my Bible students, preachers and all, I know you're very familiar with this text, these stories, but I wanted you to see these different insights. I wanted you to see how, I know we read that story of the bribery of Paul. It's kind of famous. People would know it. But just look at what was going on at that time. Not only the preaching of the gospel, but how it's revealing and exposing a lot of the wickedness. All right. Let's see now. Today I forgot to read the chapter in time. I was trying to Google it on the phone, and I was driving in the rain, and sometimes I lose my train of thought. So we're going to end with the story right now. When I was a little kid, now my kids sometimes they think like, we got to help Dad. If he starts going off the rails, we got to like bring him back to reality. So I'm thinking this morning of being a little boy in New Jersey, and my Italian grandma, who I used to call Nonna, which is my father's mother, who my kids never saw that grandma. My kids did meet my grandma on my mother's side and my grandpa. So they met their great-grandma by the name of Sophie, and they met their great-grandpa by the name of Vito, who were the Italian family on my mother's side, who came to visit us in Texas and all. But they never met my father's mother, who was my grandma on the Italian side, because she died before they were old enough to meet her. When I was a little kid, I used to go to my grandma's house, and they were real Italians, first generation Italians that came to the United States. And as a little kid, I liked going there, and she was a very good cook, my Nonna, my Italian grandma. But I remember she had a painting of a city called Pompeii. And my dad, he used to take me to the New York museums as a kid, Museum of Modern Art, Museum of Natural History. And so my father, he would always kind of try to give me little historical details of things, and he was good with that. So when I saw the painting, it's like the ruins of a city. And the city was called Pompeii. And if I remember right, my dad would tell me what happened. Because I always wonder, why do you have that painting of that city on the wall? And it has to do with Italian history of Italy. My dad told me that there was a famous volcano, and the name of the volcano was Mount Vesuvius. And my dad would tell me, I didn't remember all of the history of it, but he would tell me one time in the history of our world, in Italy, this famous, it was by the bay, I think the Bay of Naples is where it was located, in Italy. But one time, the volcano erupted, and everybody in the city of Pompeii, they didn't die from the lava and all, because it was not right exactly next to Pompeii. But all of the volcanic ash began coming to the city of Pompeii. And the people who survived this took place in AD 79, okay? AD 79, 2,000 years ago. But the volcanic ash, when it covered the city for a few days, the people that survived it said it was like pitch black. It was like we were, in hell, or the descriptions of total darkness. And there are descriptions of hell that talk about it being outer darkness. Now, 2,000 people died. This famous volcano called Vesuvius erupted other times in the history of that region, but this was the worst. 2,000 died. 2,000's a lot, if you're thinking about that day. And the city was totally lost, meaning it was so covered with volcanic ash, there was new ground like on top of it. So people knew the history of it, but it wasn't discovered until the 1700s, a few hundred years ago, 300 years ago. Some archaeologists uncovered, they found the exact location, and it was the city of Pompeii. And the amazing thing about it was when they finally excavated and got all the ash off, and it was a site, they said it was almost like the city was still intact. The skeletons of the people that were sitting in their homes that didn't realize what was happening, the people that fell asleep in their beds and all, it was almost like it was a preserved thing. And look, that was missing for almost 2,000 years, 1800 years, that city was gone. People knew the stories about it. Now, how does that fit with the wife of Felix, whose name was Drusilla? When we do Acts, we talk about history, and we talk about history of people. And a lot of people question the Bible and say, but how do we know any of this is true? And I often tell people, I say, well, you have history that covers some events that are in the Bible. Her son, who is Agrippa, I mentioned Drusilla had a son, he was one of the notable people that died in that particular incident that took place, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. Some people think that Drusilla also died in that volcanic eruption, but we know her son for sure died. And a lot of other people that died were not, you don't know the names of them, but because he was somewhat from this type of royalty and all we do know. And we don't know that from the Bible, we know that from historical records. But the people in the Bible, all of these cases of Felix and going before judges and courts and all this, look, there's many other historical records we have from first century Rome and other things that took place that show us that these are just not names of people that were picked out of thin air. Historically, we know that people existed. Events happened to them, just like we know anything in history. So one of the biggest benefits from the book of Acts in that one particular area is we got a lot of historical courts, streets, names, lawyers, and all these types of things, and where we were able to verify a lot of it. And though the eruption of Mount Vesuvius is not in the Bible, but it's a famous historical account, but one of the kids of one of the ladies mentioned in the Bible was known to have died in that particular thing. So I figured that would be the history of this little chapter. Okay, any questions? How long did I go?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, let's do another 30 minutes. All right,
Yeah,
which,
I
yes,
thought on the city
yes.
of Pompeii, though, it erupted and they were killed in the volcano, not just the ashes, but I guess the aftermath. Just
They did die as well from like lava that comes, but there were people.
Because they had the lava made them basically fossils, right? So they had.
Well, there were people that also just being buried under the volcanic ash. In that particular city, there were people that did not die from what we normally think. You see lava and people do die. But most of the deaths occurred, particularly in that, this one was known for the ash came in such a way that it covered the entire city. And of course, people die from lava and so forth, but this was kind of unique in the sense that the volcanic ash darkened all of the skies and covered that whole city. But yes, people also died from, Pompeii was not right next to Mount Vesuvius, but it was close enough that, a lot of people died. But we do also have cases where people are fossilized, they caught in lava things. But normally...
But the ashes preserve the people?
Well, if you cover anything, I mean, what we find today, when we find actual fossils, dinosaurs and all, those are things that were fossilized because they were covered under layers of earth for long periods of time. Now, there are questions of exactly how would cause some of the events that buried the dinosaurs and so forth, that Christians actually have some evidence that it could have been from the flood. But in science, we do know, we find things that get preserved because they're covered. Without getting too much into why some Christian scientists argue that it was, we'll call it catastrophism, meaning there's some of the things we find that are in layers of the ground. One of the big debates in the area of evolution, in the area of creationism, has to do with the things that were fossilized. One of the big things we look at are the layers of the Grand Canyon, okay? And people, I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but people that go to the Grand Canyon, normally, most scientists would say, what we see of the effects of the Grand Canyon was hundreds of thousands of years because the water slowly created a canyon, and then you have all these layers, okay? Some scientists say it's possible that all those formations that you're saying were hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of years, some say the evidence seems to show that maybe these things were fossilized, not over all those periods of years. Maybe there was a catastrophe. That's what's called catastrophism. Maybe there was a catastrophe like the flood that buried all these. Now, what proof do those scientists have? Some of those layers you see, which, like I said, I've not been there, but I've studied some of this. Some of the layers in the Grand Canyon, you actually would have maybe a fossilized bird that goes through all three layers. Meaning those layers are representing tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. How would you have one particular species fossilized in 4 or 3 layers?
Yeah.
Their argument is it's possible that you're not looking at. Now, the other side would have a way they would debate it. But this debate, and I just mentioned it because in the city of Pompeii, the whole city was preserved. When the archaeologists found it in the 1700s, that was one of the amazing things, that it was almost like that city was lost in time. But yeah, you do have fossilization that takes place when things get caught in lava.
Yeah.
But I think the big event was the volcanic ash was so much, it actually
Isn't there
covered
a
it.
statue of where people were hugging each other from Pompeii?
Oh, there might be.
I think there was, that
Yeah.
they were just in bed.
Oh, and you know how, I
They died
forgot,
like that.
I forgot to mention this. I wanted to Google, I didn't get a chance to do a lot of studying because
Oh, we should watch the movie.
Oh, yeah.
well, I Googled this morning.
Yeah.
I didn't look at all I knew the history of Drusilla's son Agrippa being one of the notable people that died in that. But I didn't study anything on Pompeii, so I wanted to Google it. So I Googled this morning Vesuvius. I'm pulling up every Italian restaurant, a lot of them in New Jersey. Vesuvius Italian Vesuvius. I thought, you got to be kidding me. I said, don't you? So I actually had to Google the history of the volcanic eruption. I mean, that's how our society is.
Yeah.
You would think, let me find some information on the historical event of the eruption of Vesuvius, and I just pulled up Italian restaurants. Vesuvius, Paisano, Vesuvius meatball soup. I said, man, that happened. I said, yeah, I forgot until just now. All right, let's end with that, and we'll pray. Father, we thank you for letting us do another chapter of the book of Acts. We pray that you bless everybody that watches these studies and just continue to help people to maybe get more into their own research, their own reading, and that we'd see that we're not just reading stories in a book when we read the Bible, but we're reading history, things that took place. So we thank you for another teaching in Jesus' name. Amen.